Well, greetings, dear listeners, as our esteemed executive producer Lee Jones would say. We're back at Redemption Meditations. It's good to be back, and we're going to talk today about a topic that, in some senses, is not controversial among Christians. We are pro-life, and so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about abortion, and specifically how Christians should respond. But in another sense, it's incredibly it's becoming even more controversial, almost bizarrely. Lines are being drawn in our society in the last couple of years, but it's really through this election cycle as these elections that we've seen lately, the last, maybe it's even the last 20 years, since 2000, 25 years, the elections seem to be really getting more and more polarizing in our nation. So I wanted to talk about it, but from a pastoral point of view, not necessarily a political point of view. So anyway, there's a sort of an introduction. I am here with Lee and Steve as usual. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hi, Dana.
What's up?
So let me ask you guys, ready for this?
Of course.
Why is discussion of abortion, pro-life, pro-choice, why is this an important subject to talk about?
Well, I think this is a great example. We've talked about this in previous podcasts where there are some things that are political issues that as the church and as church leaders, we maybe don't specifically have a dog in the hunt. And this is one of those issues where we have a lot of area of overlap, where there's an issue here for us as church leaders to address, and that's appropriate. And it also happens to be a pretty hot political issue.
Yeah.
And so we're not necessarily going to run around and put up campaign signs in the sanctuary. That's outside our lane.
Uh-oh.
And we're not doing that, but we're allowed and should address things that the Bible addresses. And we'll get into that some more. I'm sure exactly what that is here, but it's fair game as a church and church leaders.
Yeah, as Christians, people matter. And so the life and death of people matters because every person is made in the image of God. And so every life has intrinsic value on that basis. And so as Christians, we should and are fully in defense of the right to life, no matter how big or small a human may be. They still are human. And so we're duty bound to, especially under we go all the way back to Adam and Eve. We are in the under the dominion mandate. We need people. People need to exist and continue to exist.
Okay, so you both kind of touched on the idea of being made in the image of God. Lee, you just said that a minute ago. What does that mean, to be made in the image of God? So that's right from Genesis chapter 2,
yeah.
Right? Male and female, he created them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mankind, male and female human beings are unique from all other creation. So to be made in the image of God means that we have a soul. We have a consciousness of who we are. We're able to reason about what we do. We exist on a level that's not merely cognitive. Every living creature thinks to some degree. I'm not talking about capacity of thought. I'm actually talking about a depth of spirit that is unique to human beings. So when I hear people online say that mankind is just another animal, I have to categorically say false. But not only on that basis, there's much more to that too. But to be made in the image of God means that we are actually created to be in relationship with God. Like responds to like. And so being made in his image means that we should be looking toward him. And that's one of the great tragedies of sin, is that we actually made ourselves his enemies rather than his friends.
Yeah,
That's a concept.
there's a value order in God's creation that is plain to see. I don't know that you even need to be a Christian for it to be very obvious, but so there are certain things that just don't have the same value in creation that other things have. So, for example, if you were going on a walk with your wife, you might stop and sit on a big rock or you might sit and stop and sit on a big tree that has fallen. Well, that tree was alive and now it's dead, but that's all right. But if it's a big animal that's died, you're not going to sit on that with going on a walk with your wife. That's weird and creepy because there's an order to God's creation, and there's just something that's just wrong about sitting on a dead cow or something, right? It's just different than sitting on a dead tree. It just is, and we all know that. And so humanity, all humans, whether we would, and this is sort of an earthly terms, there's a theological difference here, but good or bad are made in the image of God. They are image bearers, and in that sense, they are, it has been said, the crowning glory of God's creation. When we're talking about the value of valuing God's creations, human beings are it. There are other heavenly creatures, yes, but human beings are unique out of everything that we can look around and see. That there's a value there that is different, and it is worth being defended and protected. We don't just shrug our shoulders and just go, oh, well, live or die, whatever, it doesn't matter. It clearly does. And everybody in their heart of hearts knows that. Sometimes they kind of want to get around that, but we all know it's true.
So this concept of made in the image of God and human life versus any other kind of life, this is really the to use the term, the worldview difference between Christians, or even let's just say theists, but Christians specifically for us. This is the difference between Christians and non-Christians, unbelievers, those who don't believe in God, right? I was listening to Al Mohler, the president of Southern Seminary, the other day on his The Briefing podcast, and he was talking about how there's he was reading an article from a newspaper somewhere, but he was talking about how there's now animal chaplains.
Really?
Yeah. So like this woman went to seminary, like grew up, went to seminary, college and seminary in order to get a theological degree so that she could become a chaplain to essentially roadkill. To have humane, there's an interesting word, funerals for animals that died. And it's apparently this is an actual profession. Apparently it's people are in some cases paying her to do this, like it's a job. So
wow,
we would look at that and say, like, Steve raises cattle for beef. we would look at that and say, we pray for the beef as well, but it's a very different way.
Yeah.
I've prayed for a lot of beef in my time.
Yeah, that's
right.
not the same. They don't have a chaplain assigned to the herd.
So it's kind of funny to laugh at, but that is a huge worldview difference. I don't want to go too far. We're kind of get a little bit away from the topic at hand, but that leads to, like, one of the things that is growing in popularity is pets. And so people, instead of having children, they will have pets, dogs or whatever, and pets are fine. We've got a dog and there's a cat that shares a space with us. And I have no problem with pets, right? But they're not my children. So for example, when we go to the groomer or whatever, and they, in that sort of like playful voice, refer, like, say goodbye to daddy. Like, I'm sorry, this dog does not call me dad.
No.
If anything, he calls me sir.
He's not your fur baby.
Right,
He's a dog.
right. Stop it. That's stupid. I'm sorry. I get on
Well,
a tangent here.
we live in a culture of death in the West. We're surrounded by an ethos of death, and that comes in several different forms. So there's the callousness with which we treat human life as a culture, which we'll be getting into as we continue. But then there's another aspect of that too, where we begin to elevate lesser life forms over and above and against human life, and this is kind of what you're talking about. Or you'll even hear people who talk about if somebody were to hurt an animal, they would much rather that person not exist than the animal be hurt. They would be willing to eradicate the human in that scenario if they're hurting an animal. That's a disordered view of life. Doesn't mean we shouldn't seek justice where harm is being done, but a human life. And this is what Steve was already saying. A human life has intrinsically more value than that possum that got hit on the road, or the pet dog, or whatever the case may be. A human life intrinsically has more value than those lesser forms. Now, we're to have dominion over the creatures. We're to treat them properly before God. This is all, again, going back to the covenant of works with Adam, recapitulated with Noah. If we want to, anyway, I could go on.
No,
but,
yeah.
But we're to be respectfully stewarding the natural resources, which includes animal life, but not to the exclusion of human life.
So the Noah thing, I think it's actually an important point, because one of the commands that God gives is that if anybody takes when Noah comes off the ark and he reestablishes a covenant with him, or establishes a covenant with him, reestablishes with mankind, that's one of the rules he gives, or one of the laws that he gives, is anybody that takes the life of another should be put to death. Right, a life for a life. That's not rooted in the Ten Commandments. It's there in the Ten Commandments, but it's actually rooted in creation because of the value of human life. So it's not a law in a formal law, right? In the commandments, it's a law.
It's not a positive law.
Yeah, but it goes all the way back to Noah and back to creation, because every
natural law.
Human being, natural law. Every single human being is created in the image of God, and God values that life.
Yeah, God not only doubled down on that natural law, because not only did he put that in creation, it's set just because the creation exists, but then he doubles down on it by putting it in his inspired scripture too. So it's not only natural law, it's also natural law and positive law. So God not only declared it in nature, he declared it with his mouth, to speak analogically.
Yeah. So we should take that seriously then, right? Like, we should really look closely at these things, because for example, without again going too far into this, you can look at some of the laws and say, well, these are applicable to the people of Israel, right? These are ceremonial laws that are applicable to the people of Israel, but the law about human life and the sanctity of human life is rooted. Just go straight to Noah. It's rooted in mankind and God's relationship to mankind. So it's not a specific, like, well, that was for then.
Yeah. If you live on Earth, this is the law you live under.
Right. So let me kind of get into this topic a little bit more specifically. One of the arguments that is increasing, or has increased, it's been the argument for a little while, is when life actually begins. So as Christians, how do we answer that question? If somebody in the church asks you, how do you answer that question?
At conception. That's what I would say.
It's pretty clear from a few different places in the Bible that the humanity of that person in his or her mother's womb we don't ever get anything in the scripture referring to whatever that thing, quote unquote, is in mom's womb as
Something's
being
jumping in Elizabeth's
right,
belly.
right.
It's a
There's
clump
not
of cells.
anything that would lend itself to ambiguity about the personhood of that pre-born creature who I would emphatically say is a human life, distinct from the mother. So
not
it's
a clump of
always
cells.
I knew you before you were even in your mother's womb. And we get to everything in Luke about John the Baptist leaping, and the baby it's always referred to the baby in the womb. Right. Everything that we see referencing this sort of prenatal, pre-birth, pregnancy time of life is always it's always taken for granted that that's a person and not a clump of cells, or not it's never regarded any other way. So in a conversation with a Christian or someone at our church, it's the consistent counsel of Scripture that is the humanity of that person isn't in dispute in the Bible.
I really like the biblical language of knitting. It's used both in Psalm 139 and Job 10, because that's actually, when you look at on a cellular level, that's exactly what happens at conception. Is these cells are being knit together into a new person. And so that's why I think it's crystal clear, even scientifically, if you're willing to look at scientific data without a preconceived notion toward death, you'll actually find that the scriptural descriptions of what's happening as a human being is growing in the womb is actually very much knitting, and it's an active process of God. It's not simply random happenstance. Like this is on purpose by God.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that the Bible is our authority, but lo and behold, science is pretty consistent with this position about the personhood of that baby in the womb. Right at the moment of conception, you have, imagine that, a new DNA signature or identity that didn't exist a few moments before, and now does happen to exist, and it's not mom's DNA.
Yeah,
it's his or her own unique DNA, and if you start to get into, well, that can't possibly be it, we're not scientists, but I think we can go this far at least. You get into a real weird position of trying to figure out when you say, if that's not when life begins,
then when?
Where are you going, man? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Where's the starting line?
It's not even. It's anti-science. It doesn't even make a lot of sense to pick some other milestone and say, well, that it has to be here. That doesn't work.
So the language that is used often is viability, right? An age of viability. And so the pro-choice, let's just say that, the pro-choice crowd, the pro-abortion crowd, will say, well, at an age of viability, that, so many weeks is the age of viability. But that argument cannot stand, because scientific development has actually made the age of viability, like when a baby can survive outside the mother's womb, earlier and earlier, right? Because the kids are being born earlier and earlier, and medical technology has advanced such that doctors are able to keep that child alive, way preemie children alive. And the other side of that argument is, and there's an ethicist, I think he might be at Harvard, I can't remember his name, but some prominent writer in this field that says, well, actually, the age of viability is well after birth. Like a child will die if it doesn't have.
Is a toddler really viable?
Right.
They're not going to go find their own food.
So that whole argument, and there's some out there that say it should be like abortion should be, you should be able to, it's infanticide at this point. well after birth,
Yeah.
which historically speaking has been practiced by certain pagan nations or
Yes.
lands.
Mhm.
And so from a Christian standpoint, that whole concept of it has to be at conception, for all the arguments that you said, but one of them is because we can't just say it's at this this stage, this is the age of viability at 20 weeks or 25 weeks or whatever. We have to put it at conception,
Mhm.
because of that changing dynamic and it's also different for every mother and child too. It has to be that fixed state of conception. There's more arguments to it. There's theological arguments to it as well, which you guys touched on.
Well, and
But
and even pretty early in that development, that baby already is categorically his or her own body at that point.
right,
Different than a cancer cell or various cancer cells, for example, because people have tried to make that scenario too. Well, is somebody with a tumor, is that the same? No, because you can actually see this is a unique individual human body developing, and even from the earliest stages of development, it's a human being. You could run all sorts of tests and find that to be the case. And in 1 out of 1 times, in every case, allowed to fully gestate, that clump of cells will be shown to be a human baby.
Right.
So if that's the end result, then it must have begun as the same essence.
Yeah, right. It didn't start as a tumor and then turn into a baby.
Yeah,
No.
I hate that term clump of cells, because not only does it depersonalize, it also, again, comes back to that sort of happenstance language. It's just a clump of cells. It's like, a few cells coalesced and it's causing problems. We need to get rid of it. It's a knitting project.
I think people who use that term like it because it gets back to, we touched on this a little bit. There is a God ordained order to creation.
Mm-hmm.
And people who don't particularly like God are always trying to find ways to upend the created order given to us. So this person in the womb isn't a person, they're just a clump of cells. God created them male and female. No, he didn't. There's this war of worldviews, if you want to call it that. That might be there's probably a better term, but there's a war, a spiritual war going on about creation and the order of creation, and abortion is certainly at ground zero of that war, but it's not the only thing. But abortion's right there, where people are trying to cast off the way God has ordered his creation and try to undo it in some sense and redefine it as kind of a way to sort of thumb their nose at God. I don't like how you've set this up, so I'm going to come up with my own rationale for how this works.
I think we need to connect that, what you're saying there, Steve, to the fact that the rise in our nation, let's say the Western world, the rise of sexual immorality, rampant sexual immorality in our sort of Western Christian-y culture, coincides with this, right? It's not a coincidence that the Roe versus Wade decision was initially handed down in 1973, right after the late 60s, and the love generation and free love and all of that. It's not a coincidence. And you can actually trace it back much further than that. You can follow in our nation's history back into the 20s, especially. And so we have to tie these things where we're not really talking about just simply. So the other side of the argument, our opponents are saying, well, this is a medical procedure and it should be between, a woman and her doctor, or really it's the woman's decision. And we're saying actually it's a result, like abortion should not be birth control, right?
Right.
It's a result of, by and large, this is a result of promiscuity, of fornication. It's a result of sexual immorality. And if you're gonna, if you're trying to say
The
no, this is
decision was
actually
made before the positive pregnancy test. The decision had
right,
already
right,
been made. Yeah.
right. There are consequences to our actions, right? And this is a consequence. Pregnancy is designed for a very specific having children. Sex is designed within parameters for a reason.
Right.
So this rise of promiscuity, of fornication and sexual immorality is coinciding here, and it's really, really become a just another method of birth control. So let's put these two things together. Go ahead, Lee. You were going to say something.
Well, even ancient examples of abortive practices are almost 100% of the time related to ritual or cultic sexual activities involved in various pagan worship too. So we can't bury the fact. Again, we've said it already, but there's a spiritual warfare aspect to all of these fronts. Not only the issue of abortion, but also that increased promiscuity that we see across Western culture. Period. Not just the U.S. We're not special in that regard, but there's definitely an ongoing spiritual war afoot, and this is one of the ways that we see it played out in real life. There's a religious connection to this.
I want to add one thing in the midst of this war. So one of the things that the pro-abortion side has done, which is actually clever, it actually has a kind of a logic behind it, is pointing out the idea that you have a man and a woman who caused this pregnancy, and the man was much more easily able to abandon his child. Like, I don't know what, this isn't my kid, and just adios, I'm out of here. And biologically, obviously, the woman can't do that the same way. And so we as Christians would say, well, we need to address the man abandoning his child. The world is saying, no, we just need to figure out a way that the woman can abandon the child. And there's really not a good way to do that without destroying the child. But in order to get her, this quote unquote, caught up to what the man can do, here's our solution. And so now the argument is like, oh, this is an equality issue. It's an equality issue. So we would be egalitarian also, in the sense that we don't think either one of you should abandon the child. Right? Like, it's not, you're right. It is unfair in that sense that the man can just ditch you and just not take care of this person he helped create. That's wrong. But the answer we would prescribe is, dude, you got to take responsibility.
Yep.
There's a big difference there.
So let me shift gears just a little bit and ask you this question. Should then, if we believe that abortion is wrong, that it's evil, that it's a sin, that it's a taking of a life, and we believe that life begins at conception, then we need to logically come to the conclusion that abortion should be abolished, right? As a legally abolished in our society. Okay.
Yeah.
Does that make us, I'm going to use a very specific term, does that make us abolitionists?
Throwing jargon.
For those of you who can't hear, Lee sighed internally but visibly.
I would say kind of, but the problem is there are, as with anything that involves people, the abolitionist movement has its own issues. So I would want to be careful how much we use that label for ourselves. or I'll at least say for myself, everybody, according to your own conscience, do what's right. But um, part of it is because in my thinking, in my pretty conservative worldview, I actually think that politics and then of course the areas of American legal code, all those kinds of things. These are downstream of culture. A culture will dictate its nation's laws more than anything else. And so I would actually say even before we attack the books, this is really a gospel issue before anything else. And
Yes, and amen.
yeah, okay.
Go, keep going.
Yeah, because I think you're not going to eradicate the callousness toward the unborn until people get a sense of not only the image of God, the sinfulness of sin, and the state that we're in as humanity, broadly speaking. And the gospel answers all these things. I think it would take, I think it will take a strong gospel witness across the world. But we can speak especially for the U.S. within our own communities, our own states, especially now in a post-Roe world, which is weird to say. Because each state's going to be battling over this, and some states have done better than others. But laws can be overturned. Supreme Court rulings can be overturned. We've seen that. But once God actually changes a human heart, it can't be overturned. So that's the real battleground, is actually human souls and seeing them reconciled to God, repenting of their sin, and loving their neighbor. This is a loving your neighbor problem too, not just hating God, but also hating your neighbor, your unborn neighbor.
Yeah. So part of the problem that I see with the abolitionist movement, to use that term, but first of all, it's actually a brilliant term, because how can anyone who is pro-life, like any Christian, if you're asked, so are you an abolitionist? Do you want it completely abolished? My answer is yes.
It should be, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Life begins.
I don't want this to occur.
Right. It needs to be completely eradicated from our society somehow.
Yeah.
Just like any other type of murder.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But there's this movement that's pretty it's not gospel centered. It's very political, and it's very out for blood politically. And when you're dealing with actual people, so the Bible, one of my mottos, Bible verses that I apply to my ministry is just that sentence fragment: with complete patience in teaching. As pastors, as elders of the church, we have to just kind of patiently walk with people through these things. And so I'm not as concerned. Now, don't hear me say don't be involved in the political spectrum. I'm not saying that. But my bigger concern, as Lee was just saying, is the hearts and souls of the people that we minister to. So if it's here or the local pregnancy center, I'm going to be concerned about their hearts and souls. I want them to choose life every single time. I want to walk with them in the months after they make the decision, in the years after they make the decision to keep the baby. And if they, sometimes we'll have somebody come in to the local pregnancy center that is post-abortive, that has had abortions or maybe more than one, and then has either come to Christ or sometimes not, but still living with huge amounts of guilt over that. I want to minister to that person, and I want them to know Christ and Him crucified. I want them to understand that forgiveness is actually very expansive. That Christ forgives sins. That phrase in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and such were some of you. Right, there's an implication in there that there are former prostitutes and adulterers and on and on and on in the congregation. In fact, in that case, probably most of the congregation was made up of
probably
at that church.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring that up because yes, we are abolitionists in the sense of I absolutely want abortion to be completely abolished. I want there to be no, I even would say, exceptions. Um, I don't think
Yeah.
there should be exceptions to the laws, right? Except
Based
in the
on
case of rape or
circumstances.
incest. Yeah, right. Like that, the child is not the victim of the crime,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
The child should not be punished, put to death for the father's crime.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and I realize that's going to mean some really difficult situations. I understand that, but if we believe that life begins at conception, then there can't be exceptions to that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's important for us to be to recognize that we as Christians would not say to anyone, I really wish you never existed. The world would be a better place if you never existed. Now, we can hate the circumstances of someone's conception. It could be
Right.
horrific, but that doesn't mean I look at some person and say the world would just be better off if you never existed. And it's just, if only you weren't here, the world would just be a better place, is a horrible thing to do and to say. And I think one of the things that people do, despite the fact that the vast majority of abortions are just two people willfully engaging in immorality,
Mhm.
and then afterwards going, oh no, I don't really want to deal with the consequences of this, and so we see abortion as the answer. Uh, Despite that, it's certainly, there's an emotional trigger when you talk about some of the common things people throw out there as the exceptions, because the circumstances are horrifying. But that argument is always built on sort of a foundation or a presupposition that, well, there's no consequences or emotional trauma from the abortion. It's only if you bring this life into the world. That's horrible.
That'll
But if
solve
you have an
everything.
abortion, it's just like, I'm just going to get my teeth cleaned. It means nothing. There's not there. Of course, there's no women out there, as you said, Dana, who are just wrecked by the fact that they participated in this. So
Mhm.
it's not like there's this idea that one thing is going to re-traumatize somebody and the other thing is just a free lunch. And
Right.
we utterly reject that. We just don't believe that that's the case. The damage has been done, and this is going to be really difficult either way.
Yeah.
Either way.
And I want to point out there's not always trauma or guilt feelings,
Right.
and that's the result of a hardened heart.
Yeah.
And our society is going there. Our collective hearts are getting harder on this issue over time. So the world keeps saying it's just a clump of cells, it's your body, your choice, blah blah blah. Right? The world keeps throwing all these arguments at women, at us, and men believe this too, but throwing it at women, and increasingly, women are less. They're less concerned about the life. So it used to be in the life ministry. So I just did a training yesterday for our local pregnancy centers, and so I was teaching the sort of the theological component. And one of the things that we've noticed in the pregnancy care centers is it used to be, say, 20 years ago, that if you had a pregnancy center, like a pro-life pregnancy crisis pregnancy center, they called them then. If you had a pregnancy center and could get an ultrasound machine, a sonogram in the center, so if you could show a mom if she could hear the heartbeat, if you could show her a picture of the baby and say, it's a boy, it's a girl, whatever, if they could see that image, then it would convince them that it actually is a baby. And studies showed for quite a while it worked. Like they would decide to keep the baby. They would be convinced this is a baby, not a clump of cells, and keep the baby. More and more now, especially the younger generations, are coming in and saying, "I don't care. I don't care that I know it's a baby. I don't care. My body." This to use the
culture
tumor
of death marches on.
Yeah. So to use the tumor analogy from earlier, it's almost like the baby is a leech, right? Like it's something that against my will is happening inside of me, and I need it taken out. I need, this living being. I know that you're right. I know that it is, but I want it removed. I want it gone because my, like, selfish, my plans, my life, my whatever doesn't fit with this right now. So there's this hardening of a heart now that's getting worse and worse and worse, like overall in our society. I needed to mention that because the argument that if you can convince someone, that's, we still try to let them understand that like that baby is a baby, that it is a human being made in the image of God, but sometimes they don't care, and that's not.
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah.
I actually saw a story online. It was on Facebook. Somebody posted of within the state somewhere. There was a group of Christians outside a Planned Parenthood, and one of the prospective customers walked up to them, handed them her sonogram, and said, "Here, you want to see the baby I'm going to go kill today?"
Yeah, that was
like you were saying, that complete hardness of heart. Like she knew exactly what she was going to do, and she didn't have any problem telling somebody who disagreed with her exactly what she was going to do.
Yeah,
we've had, as they say, saying the quiet part out loud. All the jargon is being dropped.
We've had women come in that are, 20 years ago they had an abortion and they never told anybody, and they've been they've repressed that for 20 years, and now something has brought it up and they're filled with guilt.
Yeah,
we've had that. And that's happening more and more, right?
Yeah.
So the guilt comes out later. And that, I believe that's the Lord working on the hearts, right? On sinful hearts. You talked about being knit together in Job 10. We brought this up earlier. The verse is, so it's really all of chapter 10, but in verse 8, it says, "Your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether." So he's talking about his punishment, but God made me. But then down in verse 11, "You clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me together with bones and sinews." And as soon as I read that, when you said that, Lee, I immediately thought of Ezekiel. And when he preaches the gospel, God says, "Prophesy, prophesy," and the dry bones start to come together, and they start to rattle and shake, and as they're coming together, and then sinews, like God is recreating them. And we've seen women come in that are just filled with guilt, and I think it's early steps of God calling them to Himself.
Yep.
So the gospel is powerful. We need to remember that. Romans 1 says that the gospel is the power of God for salvation. And so when we think of like those with hardened hearts, and I just need to say this so that people understand it. Like, abortion is not the unforgivable sin. It's sin.
Right.
It's murder. It's the taking of a life. But God is rich in mercy. And God is mighty to save, and the gospel is powerful and can take out your hardened heart, your heart of stone, and give you a heart of flesh. I think that's such an important thing for people to hear, that we're not. One of the things. So asking about abolitionists. One of the things one of my criticisms of those in that movement is that they really come across as just harsh and almost angry, wanting to fight about it. And hey, I'm willing to fight about this, right? but when it comes to sharing the gospel, the weapon of my warfare is not my mouth, and it's not me shouting at people or threatening people or whatever. The weapons of our warfare is the power of God, the gospel. And that's the key weapon that we have, right?
Yeah,
and if our actions don't adorn the gospel, we're going to do it wrong, and we'll be unfaithful servants.
Yeah, I think that's important that we are clear that our ultimate goal as Christians who are pro-life is not to somehow compel two people who are really disappointed that they could not kill their child to not be able to do that and then die and go to hell. That's not the goal here. We're as you said, the gospel is the weapon of our warfare, and of course we do affirm life, but it's not simply to just run around and kind of bend people to our will, people who are condemned in their sin, and bend them to our will. That's not really that's not written under our mission statement, that we're just going to get people begrudgingly to sort of fake some sort of morality anytime somebody's looking, and because I can't get away with it anymore, and still be condemned in their sin is not the business that we're in.
Okay, so hopefully what's clear as we've talked through all of this is that we're actually more concerned about hearts and minds, souls of people than the political spectrum. That's
100%.
we've what's that?
100%.
Yeah. Okay. So that's our whole goal. We're not here to talk about voting or anything like that. But we have mentioned some things that our belief and our stance based on the Bible informs then what we think about what's going on in our political spectrum today, in our political society. So, for example, no exceptions, right? So the Donald Trump came out with a statement this week that I actually printed it out so that I could read it. His pre-statement, he made a pre-statement, and then he made a video with the statement. But the pre-statement says, Republicans and all others must follow their hearts and minds. That's a problematic statement, but remember that, like Ronald Reagan before me, I and most other Republicans believe in exceptions for rape, incest, and the life of the mother. So I'm going to take exception to that, right? I'm going to say I don't agree with that. I am not going to be an exceptions person. And then so again, I don't want to go too far down the political road because that's not my area of expertise. But we can look at he makes some other statements that makes me say he's actually pro-choice in the
always has been.
Yeah. And I'm going to acknowledge that his Supreme Court appointments in his first term were important, right? Mm-hmm. Those were the judges that were instrumental in overthrowing Roe versus Wade, which was the right thing to do. Yeah. That was justice. Kicking it back to the states, mm-hmm. But then the states have done, including our state, injustice with that. So I'm gonna give him credit where credit is due, but he's not really pro-life, not in the sense that we are. On the other hand, his opponent, the current president, who claims to be religious, practicing Catholic, and the Catholic Church is against abortion. He's not just pro-choice. He's actually pro-abortion. I think there's a difference. Trump would be pro-choice in the sense people use that term pro-choice, and they often now it means pro-abortion. They actually don't want you to have a choice. They want abortion at any cost and for any reason. That they would say that having a child, to use Clinton's term, that having a child will be safe, legal, and rare. And that was what Clinton said about abortion.
Yeah.
But Joe Biden, so the left, the Democratic Party, the left and led by the figurehead of Joe Biden, his words and his actions are incredibly pro-abortion. They're evil in this area, wanting to reinstate, and not just reinstate, but make free access to abortion available to everyone. Here's the question. How political should Christians be on this issue?
Well, I would say the first thing I would say is this is why we don't put our faith and hope in political candidates.
Amen.
Give them long enough, and sometimes they don't need much time at all. They're going to disappoint you. We put our faith and hope in a king, not a president. And politicians are going to do the politically expedient thing. And both of these particular candidates are doing what they feel is the political right move according to polls or advisors or whatever, in order to satisfy the people they think they need to satisfy. And we're just not in that business as a church. That's not what we're doing. So our faith and the Bible informs our values. And just like everyone else, even people who aren't Christians or hate Christianity, we're going to vote in line with our values. That's going to happen. But we're not a political animal in the same way that the sort of person who's going to run for president is very much a political animal. I mean, that's kind of your priority if you're running for that kind of office. And we're just not in that world in the same way. We're just not. It doesn't mean that there's not overlap. We've talked about that. There's a lot of overlap, but our primary concerns are what values does the Bible counsel, and then we're going to tend to vote in a way that reflects those values. And we're not going to have a political rally on Sunday morning. Or we're not going to, in lieu of a sermon, have some political candidate come and give a stump speech.
Yeah.
We're not in that business. We don't do that here. So it's just a very different thing we're doing.
So the question then is for people at church, right? For people in the pews, can they vote for somebody who has a, so sometimes the word is incrementalist. I don't know that Donald Trump is an incrementalist. I don't think he's trying to accomplish that, because I think he's actually backtracking what he accomplished in his first term with this statement. But can we vote for somebody who is more, let's say, less pro-life than we are? Both candidates of the major parties one is pro-abortion, and one, I'm using the term is pro-choice. He's not going to say he's pro-choice, but he's got choice in there. So I think it's pro-choice. Is it okay to vote for him?
So I think ultimately it's going to depend on your conscience and how much of an abolitionist you are. So if you're comfortable with that more incrementalist approach, like you mentioned, I think that would be fine. I could totally understand somebody sitting out that vote and just not voting for either of them. And I would respect that decision. I do think that when we have the chance to vote on this issue, so let me backtrack a second. Christians should vote for righteousness whenever a thing comes up to a vote, regardless of whatever policy that might be about. If it comes before you as a vote, you should vote in accordance with righteousness. So that's just a blanket statement. If this vote does not accord with righteousness or moving toward righteousness, then I would vote either against or or give your vote to a different candidate who would be more in line with a Christian ethic, I guess.
But
It's hard.
this is a really hard question, and this is something that here's what's going to happen: is people are going to be listening to a discussion like this, and they're going to say, "Well, it's easy. You just do, and then whatever they think is what you do, right?" And but it can be hard because especially like in this election, we haven't had a landslide election since 1984 or something like that.
Something like that.
Walter Mondale and Ronald Reagan. And so for the last 25 years or something, it's been like down to the wire. And if I can't bring it in my conscience to vote for either of these candidates, we very well could have I don't even like to use this phrase, but the lesser of two evils. We could have the greater of two evils win, right? And then we'd be further back as a society. So these are really hard things because I don't want to compromise my convictions. And I am solidly pro-life. I've got several years of ministry and work even outside of the church, or in addition to the church, that should sort of give me some credentials in that. And I'm solidly pro-life. And this whole thing is difficult and disappointing, I guess. I did not believe that Donald Trump was pro-life in 2016 when he ran. And he did some really important things for the pro-life cause in that first term. And now he comes out with a statement and he explicitly says, so that I can get elected. And so I don't actually know, does he believe this statement, or is he just saying this so that he can get elected and then he's going to be more pro-life when he gets in office, which is what he did before? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's the slipperiness of politicians. And ultimately, I don't have to answer before God for what he did.
Right.
So I'm put at a crossroads here because that's the nature of the state in which I live, the United States, the state of Ohio. We could break this down however granular we want to do it. But I do stand before God and will give an answer for what I've done, for my actions and my intentions. And so I think you truly do have to search your heart, make it a matter of prayer long before election day, study the scriptures, seek counsel, and make a truly informed decision, not merely on political matters, but really spiritual matters.
And we as a church, we as the elders, the ministries that we're involved in, we're going to continue, whatever the outcome of an election, we're going to continue to pick up the pieces of evil men promoting evil. We're going to continue to pick up the piece. We're going to continue to preach the gospel and share a reason for the hope that is within us, and proclaim forgiveness of sin, whatever the outcome, whether it is a net better for Christians or a net worse for Christians in the next couple of years. We're going to continue to preach the gospel. So I wanted to have that discussion just because of all of the stuff that's going on in our society right now, and I think it's okay to have it and to come to the conclusion, man, these are hard things. These are hard things to think through and to talk about, and knowing that there's going to be people listening to this that disagree with us. There are sometimes people who disagree with our title, and they comment on the disagreement with our title without watching.
Didn't watch the video. I think.
Why didn't you talk about this thing you talked about for an hour?
Yeah. I think this is a perfect example of why we don't sit here on this podcast or stand behind the pulpit on Sunday morning and say, hey, all of you vote this way, or don't vote, or
right.
or we don't do that. And I think, you're going to more and more probably have very real things that leave you a little disappointed with your political choices on election day. And
I think it's going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, I think as the culture becomes more secular.
Yep.
You know, you're going to have choices between two people, neither one of which you would want as a church elder, or you would want one of your kids to marry or whatever. But I think if you think back to the very early church, if they had the ability to vote and they had elections, and you had the choice between two Caesars who were both godless, pagan, immoral people, but one of them said, "Hey, maybe we should quit setting the Christians on fire." It would be okay if the Christians
Or
said,
it would
"Well,
be-
I kind of like that guy
It
better
would be
than the
maybe
one
we
who
should
wants to
set
keep
fewer
setting the
Christians on fire. Yeah, their argument would be maybe we should set fewer Christians on fire.
Oh, perfect example. Yes. So if you wanted to vote for that person, I'm not going to say, "Oh, you can't do that. Look at what a terrible guy he is." He is a terrible guy,
Right.
but sometimes we're left with a choice between two terrible candidates. And so now we have to vote according to our conscience, and we're not thrilled with either one, and do the best we can. That's okay. This is the world where it's so rare to get to vote in the history of humanity. That's an anomaly. So if you don't want to just shrug your shoulders and say, "Well, forget it, I'm just not going to vote because I think both choices are creeps," we're not going to tell you no, but you know that it's okay to vote for somebody who's very, very imperfect.
Yeah,
there's an aspect of this. There's an aspect of this too that, we're called to pray for kings and all those in authority, that we might lead peaceful and quiet lives. That's not. I don't believe that. I think the church is supposed to do that. I think I do that. I try to do it every Sunday when we gather together. But I think part of the problem that we're having in our society, we're not doing that. Like, Christians are not praying for their leaders. They're watching the news and complaining about it, but not praying for it. And so that's maybe a different topic. But we need to be like, we have responsibilities that the Bible lays out. That is one of them. And so if we're not following God's imperatives, right? If we're not doing what God has told us to do in His Word, then it's no wonder that our society is going the way that it is if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing.
And it's hard to do that because, typically throughout history, it's men of a lesser moral character who seek these executive offices. So more often than not, you are going to deal with a very wicked man at the top of whatever that political pyramid is that you live under. It's hard to pray for your enemies. That's why we had to be instructed, pray for your enemies. Bless those who persecute you. It's hard and unnatural to a sinful human. So
yeah,
you have to do hard things.
If Christians are supposed to pray for a Caesar, then whatever happens with the election in November, Christians, we're supposed to pray for whoever ends up in the White House or the governor's mansion. So let's not kid ourselves that Caesar was pretty terrible. It was horrendous government in the early church, and they were commanded, pray for your leaders. So we're supposed to pray for our leaders no matter what happens.
Yep.
Yeah.
So let's summarize it by saying Christ is King, Jesus is Lord.
Amen.
Right.
That every single person is made in the image of God, and we are responsible to go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that Christ has commanded. And remembering, and lo, I am with you always to the end of the age. So we have a commission, and that's what we need to be about, what we need to be doing. Okay, so shall we ascend a ladder of library?
Let us.
Steve, you first.
Okay, so I did something a little different. We were just talking about somebody asking about Genesis. So if you want to do there's a time to just read, and then there's a time to do a more in-depth study. And if you want to consider a more in-depth study of Genesis, this commentary by Gordon Wenham has been helpful to me, and it might be something that you might find useful if you're going to dig in deep. And Genesis is for sure one of those books that people like to dig in deep on. So I've used it. It's been helpful. And there's a time and a place to do that. And that might be one that people might like.
All right. Lee?
Well, so I've been on an airplane. I couldn't bring my whole library with me. But I have a great book that I've been reading beachside and poolside, actually on my Kindle. Really, really good. It's The Trinity, an Introduction by Scott R. Swain. It's normally a green book, but of course, can't show color on a Kindle. But really great, really readable primer on Trinitarian theology and some really, really important concepts that he breaks out. Ultimately, to the point of the whole reason we study theology is to be more consistent with Scripture's witness about God and his character. So this is one really good, really focused, and relatively short work on a particular aspect of theology that's super important. So The Trinity, an Introduction by Scott R. Swain.
So it's funny that you used your Kindle because I did an audiobook.
Oh, look at us.
And I actually printed a picture of the cover.
Awesome.
We're
This is
so
a brand new
high-tech
book
here.
by Joe Rigney. The name of it is Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. And the subtitle is Resisting the Anxiety That Will Wreck Your Family, Destroy Your Church, and Ruin the World. And it's a great cover with that.
What a title.
Whatever that is.
Nice. Spooky.
Joe Rigney. The first part of it, he sets it up and he spends a lot of time talking about Shakespeare and he's having to set it up. So you got to kind of slog through that. But the last three sections, I guess, in particular, are excellent. Where he talks about family, church, and world. Really good book. In fact, my wife is also listening to it. And maybe she's finished it by now. As an audiobook, it took 3 hours. So I listened to it while I was doing yard work and some stuff one day.
Bad.
So it's not very big. I'm probably going to buy a paper copy because I want to have some of the information, especially in those last 3 chapters. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage.
Nice.
Okay.
Very good.
Well, Lee,
The time has come.
The hot tub is calling you.
It is. It is. I can't wait to rejoin the hot tub. So the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen.
Amen.